Hi everyone, I want to welcome you to the second lecture of the course. My name is Mitchell Taylor. I'm a sociologist here at the university, and my academic specialty is sociological theory. And this is really going to be a lecture on sociological theory. We're interested today in the foundations of the discipline and the history of the discipline. And in many ways, thinking about the history of the discipline is thinking about theory. Right? The history of sociology is a history of different theories, different perspectives and ideas and approaches to thinking about the social world. And today I'm going to walk you through some of these early approaches. I think many students, when they hear that word theory, they think of something dry, they think of something technical and inaccessible and inapproachable. But what I really want to show you today is theory can be fun, it can be interesting, and it can be really useful in your efforts to understand and think about the social world. So the lecture today is going to be presented in 4 parts. In part 1, we're going to be talking about some proto-sociology, so the very earliest foundations of this academic discipline as it began to emerge. And then we're going to be thinking about 3 key figures in the history of social theory: Karl Marx, Max Weber, and Emil Durkheim. We'll cover Karl Marx in part 2. We'll cover Durkheim and Weber in part 3. And in part 4, I'll talk a little bit more about the status of sociological theory today. In coming weeks in the course, you are going to be hearing about all manner of theorists and theoretical concepts. And the purpose of today's lecture is to really set up that content to give you a sense of where this discipline began, some of its earliest concerns, and how those early concerns filter into many of our contemporary discussions. All right, let's get straight into it. This is part 1, and as I said, we're looking at the very foundations of the discipline and the foundations of social theory. Let's start with this question of what theory actually is. Theories can essentially be thought of as the frameworks that we use to understand, explain, interpret, and sometimes to critique key aspects of the social world. I think the easiest way to understand what theory is to understand the difference between theory on the one hand and empirical research on the other. So most sociologists are engaged in the process of empirical research. And empirical research is where we go and try to collect data and information about the world. So when someone does a survey, for example, or they might go and interview people, they might do focus groups with people, they might be sitting and analyzing what's going on in the media, that is collecting empirical research. And ultimately the goal of empirical research is to generate theories. And theories are broad generalizations, more abstract level generalizations about how the social world works. Right? The hope is that by combining a whole range of empirical knowledge about the world, we can develop these bigger generalizations that apply to broader groups of people, for example, or many different kinds of societies. And theories essentially then form our stock of knowledge. Right? Our theories are what gives us a stock of knowledge in sociology. So when we're doing empirical research, we're trying to develop theories, but sometimes we're also testing theories as well. We might have certain ideas, certain understandings about how the world works. We might go and collect data to see if these theories are correct or if there are changes that need to be made to these particular theories. Now, that might sound complicated, but I think it's easiest just to think of theories as answers to questions. Right? We all have questions about the social world. It doesn't matter if we're sociologists or lay people outside of the university, we all have questions about how the social world works. And what theories provide us with is potential answers to those questions. A theory is not necessarily correct. A theory is not necessarily something that everyone believes in or everyone supports. It is a possible answer to a question that we might have about the social world. And hopefully the theories that we generally draw upon are theories that do have a high level of support from empirical research. But as you'll see today, sociologists disagree on a whole range of different issues, and many of our key theorists have deep disagreements about the way the social world actually works. When we're looking to answer questions about the social world, I think it's really useful to divide those questions into 3 separate categories. We have questions about social order, questions about social action, and then questions about social change. So questions about social order are about the way societies are organized. Why do certain people have power over others, for example? Why do we live in a capitalist society or a democratic society? Why are certain features common across all human societies? Marriage, for example. Almost every human society that's ever been studied has something that looks like marriage. Why is that the case? Right? Those are questions about social order. There are also questions about social action, and these are questions about behavior. Right? Why do human beings behave in the way that they do? So we could ask, why is it that human beings get married? We might ask, why do men and women often behave in different ways? Why might men and women pursue different occupations, for example? Is that because of some fundamental difference in male and female biology? Or does it have something to do with the way that we are socialized into different interests, for example? We can also ask questions about social change. We know that societies are not static. Right? We know that the societies we live in today are very, very different to the societies we lived in the past. And many of the early social theorists were living in an era of rapid social change. And they were trying to understand what is going on. How is the world changing? And how should we respond to that change? How should we feel about that change? Are these changes positive? Are these changes negative? These are questions we can ask about the topic of change. So I think basically every question you can ask about the social world will come under at least one of those three headings. And when we think of different theories in sociology, what they provide us with is different kinds of answers to those questions. As we'll see in today's lecture, the question of why do people get married? Why is marriage a common feature of human societies? The way that a conflict theorist might answer that question is very different to the way a functionalist might answer that question. Why be interested in theory? Well, as I said, there is a kind of historical interest here in the sense that the history of sociology is a history of key theories and ideas. But let's talk about the practicalities of theory. I think theories are important because they help orient us when we do research. They tell us what we're looking for, where to start our investigations. Again, they give us possible answers to questions that we might go and try to test or collect some information on. And they also help us to systematize our knowledge. Sociology is full of individuals doing little small-scale studies. And if all we had was those little studies in different areas, we would never have any kind of collective, systematic knowledge. I used this term earlier, a stock of knowledge. Right? What have we actually discovered as sociologists? What we're trying to discover are theories. Right? Broad, abstract generalizations that can apply to a wide range of different areas. And generally, the more abstract and broad the theory, the better it is, the more useful it is, because it can apply in all these different kinds of areas. I think theories are important because when we theorize, it means we don't have to start at square one. Right? If I'm studying some new social phenomenon, I don't have to dig the well, so to speak. Right? I don't have to try to think, well, how on earth do I begin with this particular topic? Right? If I have a question about some new social phenomena, I can draw upon the knowledge of the past. I can think, what have earlier sociologists said about this? Can they provide me with concepts or explanations that can help me understand what's going on in the present moment? I think theories are also really important because they're not just scientific things. And this is where there is a very big difference between the theories we have in the social sciences and the theories that you might find in, say, physics or chemistry or biology. The theories we have in sociology influence the world. Right? In making theories about human behavior, we change society in really important ways. And if you're someone who is interested in changing the world, if you want to have an impact upon societies, if you want to solve social problems, for example, then you need to be interested in theories. If you want to, say, reduce inequality, well, you need to understand what causes inequality. You need to look at theories of inequality. If you're interested in gender and gender inequality, again, the same thing. You might look at feminist theory. Theories are influential on the world. They impact the world, and we also use them ourselves to impact the world. And if the government wants to make a policy about reducing homelessness, for example, then we need some kind of theories that explain what are the factors that lead to homelessness in society. So that's why I think theories are tremendously important, right? They orient us, they systematize our knowledge, but they also give us the power to actually predict change and to think about what would happen if we change this thing, right? What would be the consequences of that? And of course, most of us are interested in sociology because we want to have an impact on the world. One thing I do want to say about theory is another reason I really like participating in theory is because it really connects us to a long conversation that stretches back to the very earliest points in human history. When you think about sociology as a discipline, it really emerges in the 19th century. Sorry, that's the 1800s. So around 1850 or so is when we're seeing the first people who identify as sociologists. But the conversation about the structure of human societies that we see when we engage in theory is a much older conversation than that. It goes back to the very beginnings of human history, right? Since the very earliest humans, there have been conversations and discussions about the way society works and the ideal societies we want to live in. I've put up just 3 figures in this tradition here. We can think of the ancient Greek philosophers. Someone like Aristotle, for example, is writing books on political theory and ethics. He's thinking about the way we should live and the way we should structure our societies to produce virtue and harmony and social order. We think of someone like Confucius in the Chinese tradition, again, having a wide range of followers and a huge impact on contemporary Chinese society, as you can imagine. And Confucius was someone who was, again, interested in these questions of social harmony and social roles and how we should act as individuals, how we should act in our various social relationships, right? As a father or as a mother, as a brother, as a citizen of society. Another interesting figure here is Chanakya, who was an Indian jurist, again, writing in about 300 BC. And Chanakya was really interested in politics and power and authority, and he had a very important influence on some of the figures we're going to talk about today, including Max Weber. So what I wanted to point out just by highlighting these figures is that social theory is a tradition of thought that stretches back for thousands of years and involves really every corner of the globe. The kind of theorists we'll be talking about today are mostly European men, because this is really where social theory arose. But the contributions to social theory come from a wide range of figures from right across the globe. When we start thinking about sociology as a discipline, I said earlier that sociology begins to arise in the 19th century, and there's a few key important reasons for that. There are major historical transitions that are happening during this period, which increasingly lead to this idea that a science of society is possible. You might think, for example, about the political revolutions that are going on through the 18th century, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and so on. And these revolutions challenge existing structures of authority. People say, no longer will we simply be ruled by these particular figures. Maybe we can determine for ourselves what our lives will look like. You see the democratic revolutions that are going on at this time. And this leads many people to start thinking really seriously and deeply about the way societies are organized and our capacity as human beings to control and shape the direction of our societies. In the 18th and the 19th century, we also have the Industrial Revolution, right? The birth and the emergence of modern capitalism. And again, this leads people to start questioning technological progress and the impact of technological progress. Some supporters of this, some opponents of this, but it's a time of deep philosophy and thought around the changes that are going on. We also see the scientific revolution, right? Modern science is relatively young. It's through the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries that we start to see this belief that the world can be studied in a systematic, scientific way. It's really the scientific revolution that separates much of the earlier social thought from more modern social thought. Right, there are figures like Aristotle or Confucius who are thinking about the world, but they're not conducting experiments. They're not using the systematic collection of data to make confident claims about the world. It is the scientific revolution, first in the hard sciences and then in these more social sciences, that starts to give us this idea that there is a set of procedures or methods that we can follow to get closer to the truth about the world. And this becomes really important on the birth of sociology as a discipline. So again, I've just given you more detail on this slide about the kind of things that I'm talking about, that through the 18th and 19th centuries, there are major shifts going on in society. And these major shifts correspond with the emergence of sociology as an academic discipline. Right? The major political revolutions of the time create this intense debate about the correct way to structure society. And of course, if you're interested in that question of how should we structure society, then you want to gather knowledge about the way the different social structures might impact and affect our thinking about the world. With the Industrial Revolution, we see these dramatic reorganizations in social life. And one thing we see is the emergence of dramatic new forms of inequality, particularly new forms of economic inequality. Right? Massive differentials of wealth and power between the classes. And this again leads many people to think about, how is this society structured? Is this the only way that society can be structured? Is there a different way that society can be structured? With the scientific revolution, you get new ideas, methods, and approaches for systematically studying the world. And again, this starts in sciences like biology and physics, but it gets ported into this enthusiasm for studying the social world. And most of the early sociologists originally started in disciplines like biology. And they started to imagine, what if we took these ideas and methods and approaches from biology, these scientific ways of looking at the world, what if we applied them to the study of human society? And this is really where the notion of sociology begins to emerge. Let's talk about a few figures that were very important for the development of sociology as a discipline. This is Auguste Comte, and Comte was a Frenchman. He was alive from 1798 until 1857, and you can see that he lived just after the emergence of the French Revolution. So he was kind of raised in a society that was experiencing the throes of the French Revolution and the consequences of the French Revolution. And Comte was extremely disturbed by the kind of social disorder that he saw during this period. And this led to his interest in studying systematically how to reform society in what he thought of as a positive direction. So Comte is interesting to us because he's actually the man who coined the term sociology, in French, la sociologie. This was not his only term for the discipline. He also referred to the discipline as social physics, and this might give you a sense of his approach to sociology. Comte was a firm believer in the idea that a science of society was possible. Right? He believed that we could have a science of society, that we could use the same methods as were used in the natural sciences. Again, think of that term, social physics. Right? Comte thinks we can have a science of society that essentially looks identical to natural sciences, like chemistry, like physics, like biology. Now, this is a view which is called positivism, and this is a term which you should try to remember. Okay, positivism is the view that when we study human societies, the best approach is to use the same methods, tools, and techniques as we use in the physical sciences or the natural sciences. So anyone who believes that social science is very similar to the natural sciences or should use the same techniques and approaches, that is someone that we would call a positivist. And Comte is the person who came up with this idea of positivism. And he believed that the very purpose of sociology was to uncover the scientific regularities that occurred in the social world. Right? Just as there are laws of physics, Comte believed there are laws of society, and that it's our job as sociologists to uncover those laws. And as I said earlier, his belief was that if we knew those laws, if we understood exactly how societies operated, then we could reform and change societies for the better. Comte was what is known as a utopian socialist, and there were many French socialists at the time. Comte was a member of many of these political groups, and he believed that he could create utopia by understanding the operations of the social world. Another really important figure here is the English sociologist Herbert Spencer. And Herbert Spencer was alive between 1820 and 1903, so a little bit later than Comte. But Spencer was hugely influential in creating this new discipline of sociology and institutionalizing it as a possible specialization in England at the time. Spencer was a Victorian-era figure. He was actually a biologist originally, so he wrote many books of biology. He was an extremely influential figure in the history of biology. He was also interested in psychology, and he was also very interested in politics. He wrote many, many books on the political organization of Victorian society, many books that were directed towards the public and were advocating for certain forms of social change. He was a libertarian, and he believed that the state should recede from the public, that there should be more freedom, more liberty, more economic freedom for individuals. He was a supporter of things like free markets. So a very interesting and a very important figure. Now, Spencer was very similar to Comte in his orientation towards the social world and the study of society. So he believed that sociology should borrow from other disciplines. Like Comte, he was a positivist. Right? He was a biologist originally, and he used his training in biology to come up with methods and ideas which could then be used for the study of society. So Spencer, for example, was looking at the way that biologists operated, and he was looking at some of the terms they used, terms like function or evolution or equilibrium. He would say that what do many biologists do? They look at the parts of organisms, and they try to understand how those parts help to the organism to survive and perpetuate itself. Concepts like equilibrium became very important here. He said, if you look at organisms, they have these internal mechanisms that help maintain a state of equilibrium. Like we try to maintain a stable body temperature, for example, and there are mechanisms within us that help to maintain that body temperature even as the environment changes around us. And Spencer had a rather ingenious idea. He thought that, well, maybe societies are similar to organisms. Maybe they try to maintain certain levels of things, and maybe there are mechanisms which try to preserve that arrangement. Maybe they have parts like organs that try to perpetuate the survival of the society. Maybe, like organisms, they also go through processes of evolution. Right? They're subject to forces and pressures from the environment that cause adaptations within society. Ideas like this aren't that common in contemporary sociology, but they were really important to the history of the discipline. At the time, in the 19th century, nobody really believed that a science of society was possible. It was really dismissed out of hand. And it was figures like Comte and Spencer who said, no, it is possible to have a science of society. They actually used this organism metaphor to make that particular case. They said, look, if societies were similar to organisms, if they went through the same kinds of processes, well, nobody disagrees that biology is a legitimate science, so why can't we have a science of society as well? So I think these figures, we owe them a real debt. Right? They are the figures who actually created the possibility of this science in the first place. And even though many people don't agree with their ideas today and we've moved on and developed as a discipline, it's still important to recognize that debt and that legacy we have to these early figures. So Comte and Spencer, very important for the history of sociology. But when we think about the classic figures that really had a big impact on the modern discipline, there's three other names that are extremely important. And these names are the names of Karl Marx, Emil Durkheim, and Max Weber. We often call these figures the big three, because in every introductory sociology course or every introductory sociology textbook, you're going to be introduced to Marx, Durkheim, and Weber. They had a tremendous impact on the history of the discipline, and many of the ideas and problems and ways of thinking that are current in contemporary sociology come from these early three figures. So we're going to talk about these three figures in the next few parts of the lecture. Come back for part 2, and we'll start by talking about Karl Marx and his theory of capitalism.